Let's paint some early war Wehrmacht soldiers on the march. Like I talked about in the intro video last week, I'm painting up all 4 of the soldiers from this dragon kit, plus 2 others from this kit. Here are the 4 soldiers all assembled, without their heads and with most of their kit. Dragon 1/35th scale soldiers are like most multi-part soldier kits. They have 2 legs that glue together to make the lower torso, a body attaches to that, and then 2 arms you can position, and of course the head. I decided to start with the heads, which I superglued onto the end of some cut down toothpicks. After painting, the superglue separates from the wooden toothpick pretty easily. Sometimes a little sanding is required if the glue doesn't want to release cleanly. Starting from a zenithal highlight to help me see the shadows and the highlights, I first blended some black red and red beige to block out the shadows under the chins and in the eye sockets. An overall base color of sand brown was next, and I used a wet palette and thinned the paint down to a glaze-like consistency. A couple layers were required to get an even and full coverage. Don't be afraid to go 3 or 4 or even 5 layers. I then mixed some red beige with the brown sand to make a couple of different shades of rosy, warm browns, keeping the darker shades around the eyes and the rest hit the highlights in the chin areas, like foreheads, noses, chins, and cheeks. I also wanted to try to get some tonal variation between the various soldiers, so some got more of the lighter color, some got more of the darker color. This batch painting method helps keep the things moving and speeds up the painting time considerably. Eyes. I used a fine brush and an ivory colored paint. Don't worry too much about getting outside the lines. Don't go too far, don't go crazy, but we can come back in and reshape the eyes with skin colors after we get the pupils in place. I gave some of the soldiers brown eyes and a couple blue eyes. I tried to think about where they would be looking in the final diorama so that I didn't get too crazy with extreme eye rotation, but a couple are not looking straight ahead. Here are the finished 4 heads from the box set. Hair colors range from light brown to black, and all were achieved with a darker base coat and a dry brush with the final lighter color. Now on to the uniforms. The kit calls for all the uniforms to be painted in Fieldgrey, which was known to come in various shades, as the acid dye stuffs in the late 30s and 40s were not as color fast as dyes we have nowadays. So what I did is I mixed up several tonal variations of Fieldgrey, along with some Russian uniform and some light gray. I tried to keep the blouse and trousers different tonal gray-green colors so not to have them all become monochromatic. The process is very much like the faces, several layers of light glazes over a zenithal prime, and again, don't be afraid to come back and hit it 2 or 3 or 4 times. Here's a quick list of all the paints that I used to paint up the uniforms and the extra kit. I'll link everything in the description below. But we started with German gray, used that on the boots and anything that was black. Gray-green for some straps. Tan earth. Buff. Chocolate brown. Leather brown. Fieldgrey. Gunmetal. And Russian uniform. I know all these colors look extreme right now, like way too bright and not at all right. But trust me, after we get the next step done, they'll all come together. One of the ones that you may be really questioning is the use of gunmetal on the gas mask canisters. I know it looks super bright, metallic-y, but when we come back in with the wash I'm going to put on it, it'll tone that down and make it just look like dull aluminum, which is what they were. They weren't shiny at all. After we get everything set just the way we want it, it's time to protect all the acrylic paint with a coat of varnish. I use gloss varnish, and I let it sit overnight, at least overnight, maybe a day or two, to get fully hardened. The next step is a good filter made from oil paints. I offload all my oil paint out into some paper towels. This will absorb the extra linseed oil from the paint because what we're really after are those lovely fine pigments. And then using a mixture of dark brown from burnt umber and black ivory, I highly dilute the mixture with odorless thinner or mineral spirits. I still like to work with the window or a door open for fresh air, and I generally wear a respirator when working with this stuff. I know it's odorless because it's an annoying smell, and this thinner is still made from organic solvents, and they can do bad things to your lungs, so protect your lungs. I like to mix my own from a big box hobby store's basic oil paint sets. I got this set of 16 paints for about $10 4 or 5 years ago. I expect them to last several more years, maybe 10. And now the fun part. Just slap this stuff all over everything. It's going to look a riot at first, but don't worry. It takes ages for the oil paints to dry out, and even longer when diluted since the thinner needs to off-gas before the paint can start drying properly. Still, I give the wash about 30 to 40 minutes to flash out the thinner and start to tint the acrylic paint underneath. Earlier, I said the models were varnished before this step, and that was to protect the acrylic paint from what comes next. Taking multiple cotton swabs, I come back in and start to wipe off the excess oil wash, starting with light pressure and changing swabs that become saturated with oil or start to fray too much. Better to throw out some cheap extra cotton swabs than snap off a part and have to glue it back on later, or better yet, lose it to the carpet monster. As you get back to starting to see the underlying color, you can apply more pressure to make sure all the oil paint is off of the top uppermost raised surface. What you really want is only a tiny bit of the actual paint way down in the shadowed areas. The rest will just give you some tinting on those what were once overly bright colors, and it will tone everything down to that general grungy, dirty color you see in war. Also, stubborn areas can be dealt with by taking a thinner dampened brush and loosening up the oil paint from the hard to reach areas, and then coming back in with a dry brush and pulling off the excess paint. Like I said, don't be afraid to change cotton swabs often. This is the whole pile I used for these 4 figures. Give the figures time to dry. I like a day or 2 to make sure the thinner is gone and all the oil paint has dried. But honestly, you could leave them for a week and it would be fine. I then come back in with a matte varnish to seal it all down. Time to add the heads. A dab of super glue, and we're done. All that's left is to add the helmets and weapons and some of the photo etch. One of the issues I ran into was all the helmets were solid. So I had to get out the Dremel and shave out a ton of plastic. I was having so much fun carving out the styrene that I didn't even bother to film it. Actually, it's quite boring to watch someone just grind away at plastic. Anyhow, once they were hollowed out, I did paint them a dark green before adding the photo etched helmet liners. That way I could still paint the leather liners the proper color and still give the green underneath showing through. Anyway, here we are. The soldiers are all done. Weapons, slings, helmets, and other accessories in place. In the next video, I'll get around to building an anti-tank gun, the limber, and the horse. And once those are all completed, we can go back and finish the diorama base. We'll weather everything up with some dust and call her good. Anyhow, keep an eye out for part 2 sometime next week. And until next time, happy hobbying.